Hello, everyone. We're back. I want to thank you all for your patience in extending our sessions today. Our next and final panel is called "A View from Corrections: Do We Still Need Solitary?" So we've been trying to answer that question for most of the day, and we're certainly not going to answer it in one session for this afternoon. On our agenda, if you notice it, you'll see that we have Benny Baccio Jr. as one of our panelists, a former corrections officer who was the head of COBRA, the New York City Correction Officers Benevolent Association. Benny has just informed us that he can't join us because he is still testifying before the assembly this afternoon. But we do have, and we're really pleased to have, we have the honor of to be part of the panel, Stanley Richards, who many of you will know as the vice chair of the New York City Board of Corrections, deputy chief executive officer of the Fortune Society, who has been one of the foremost speakers and spokesmen for prison reform and works very, very closely in terms of reentry, prisoner reentry. And of course, he's a former solitary prisoner himself. So we're going to have a one-on-one conversation with him, with Graham Rayman, who is Ruben Blau's partner in crime, so to speak, is co-author of the Rikers story. Graham is also covers criminal justice for the New York Daily News and is a veteran reporter who has won multiple journalism prizes over a 30-year career. So we, as I say, will have about 45 minutes of a discussion, and we'll see where it takes us from there, and we will then close with a short Q&A for the day and then resume again tomorrow. So Graham, the gavel is yours. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me. And this couldn't happen on a better day. I mean, covering city government is sometimes like watching a construction site, but today there was high drama at City Hall. There was a hearing scheduled on a bill to ban solitary confinement that has broad support in the New York City Council, but it's opposed by Mayor Adams, the correction unions, and the current leadership of DOC. And there were these verbal clashes between members of the correction unions and advocates for the bill on the steps of City Hall. And there were also some clashes between, verbal clashes between council members and panelists. So it's been quite an interesting, fast-moving day. Ultimately, it's unclear when this bill will come to a vote. It certainly before the end of the year, before the end of the session. But and I'm so happy to talk with Stanley, who I interviewed for our book. Rayman and I interviewed. It was one of the earliest interviews that we did for the book, and I really appreciate your time. Were you able to watch this unfolding?
No, but I've been getting reports on it, and it was described as really messy. But Graham, you've been covering it. I go into this work, and this system of mass incarceration and criminal justice has, for generations, been structured in the way our country is really structured, and it's structured by having this structure in place that has to have winners and losers. And when it comes to mass incarceration, we either are for public safety, which means we have to have mass incarceration, or we're for reducing mass incarceration, and that means we're not for public safety. And those two sides prevent us from really digging in collectively to come up with solutions that will work. And I think Dr. Ford said it in the last panel. She just wished that the planning and discussion around how we fix this was broader and more inclusive. But when you come at it from a perspective that you have to have winners and losers, that's what you end up establishing, winners and losers. And what I have been saying, and what I have tried to do in my time at DOC and over my 30-year career at Fortune, is say, how do we find a win-win solution? We know from data and our experience that we can have safe communities and we can reduce the number of people who are incarcerated. We know that we could have a jail system that has accountability, that when people violate the rules and or hurt someone in an institution, that you can have swift accountability without doing lifelong traumatic damage to that individual for putting that individual in solitary confinement and leaving them isolated for them to eventually return back to general population and continue the behavior that has been occurring. And so this conversation around solitary confinement is about how do we get to win-win. And I feel what we proposed as a Board of Correction, what we were trying to do when we were at Department of Correction, Commissioner Schiraldi and I and others, was really create a win-win situation that included programs, that included accountability, that included separation, but didn't include the harshness that we know has never worked. Because here's the bottom line, and I wish we was having this conversation with Benny. Solitary confinement has been in existence forever. And has it ever reduced violence in jails and in prison? And I think we would always say no. I think there's a sense from the union that by having that tool, there was some false sense of protection for officers and for incarcerated people. There was some some sense of we get our pound of flesh when someone harms us. But we got to get out of that mode, because that has not yielded what we want. We all want our officers to be safe. We all want incarcerated people to be safe. We don't want family members worrying about whether or not their family member is going to make it home or not. Are they going to come home in a casket? We can do that. The time is now to do it.
I would certainly say that, and you're aware of this, that when the jail population was much larger, 15, 20,000, particularly in the 90s, and the Central Punitive Segregation Unit was in full operation. That was the place, the much feared place that was called the Bing. The origin of that name has different ideologies, but there were just as many. There were many stabbing and slashings. Violence was extreme in a way that we haven't seen for a long time. So I think you're correct in that assessment. I don't think that was much of a deterrent. And there's a very strong argument to make that when you came out of the Bing, you were ready to take no prisoners. And when you got out.
Yeah, you're in survival mode. When I was in solitary confinement, that's when HDM was open, and HDM used to be the Bing, right? And that's where I did my solitary at. And when you came out of there, you again learned how to survive in a different way. You learn how to survive being isolated, and then you go back into general population. And in that environment overall, I always say you either the predator or the prey, right? So you go into the survival mode that when you are confronted with a situation, you know how to deal with that particular situation. And that situation is usually a fight or hurting somebody, or you get hurt, right? That's the sort of nature of the jail. And that's one of the things that we're trying to change. When the last administration, we went to Europe to look at the European system. We went to Norway. And what they said is that there's a couple of principles they operate off of. One is that someone's punishment or someone's removal from society and their accountability is not centered on conditions of confinement. So the conditions on confinement are centered on the humanity of the individual. You don't lose your humanity because you've been convicted of a crime or because you are detained. You don't lose that. That was number one. Number two, it was this notion that when people came into the system, it was the system's obligation to provide the kind of supports and resources to allow that person to begin to reflect on and to begin to incorporate new tools and new ways of living, that when they get released better off than they came in. And they personally took that as, that's my job. And everything they did, from officer training, that was 2 years, officer selection, facility design, facility programming, was all part of this 2-pillar approach. Conditions shouldn't be what determines someone's punishment, whether they're removed from the community or not. And our job personally is to make sure that they are better off when they go out, because if they come back, then in some respect, that's a reflection on how well that particular institution did. And we haven't gotten to that place. We have a system where over 80% of the people detained in New York City jails have not been convicted of anything. We have rhetoric that talks about people who are incarcerated in our New York City jails as if they are the enemy, like they have been convicted and tried already. They are bad people that can never shed their experiences or their charges, that for some reason bad people need to be treated badly. And we gotta get out of that, because that doesn't help us. It doesn't make our community safer, and it doesn't make officers safer.
Yeah, there was it was striking to me today, this either or thinking, even, continues to be such a powerful force, a reactionary force on this issue. I mean, even today in a council, there was a city councilwoman who said, essentially, these people aren't there for stealing a loaf of bread, and she also said, this is a city that has turned criminals into heroes. That's a direct quote. And the kind of nuanced approach that you're talking about, it just seems so hard to do when you have people who think that way. How do you get closer to that?
I think we do what we've always done, and that's continue to have a conversation. At Fortune Society, one of the things we try to do is to put a face on this issue, because in years past, it was like a faceless issue where you could say something like that, but you didn't have a face to it. But when you begin to put a face to it, when you begin to say, how would you want your family member treated? How would you want your neighbor treated? When you begin to associate that with how someone you love could be caught up in that system, that begins to change, one, the lens in which people look at the folks who are in our system, and two, the kind of work that we need to do together. And I started by saying, if you're for public safety, you're for mass incarceration. If you're for reducing mass incarceration, that means you're not for public safety. And that's just not true. I mean, I live in the Bronx. I was born and raised in the Bronx, and I do this work. And I never left the Bronx, because my commitment and where I draw my strength from is living in the communities that I might have devastated when I was out there selling drugs and committing crimes, to give back in a way that is hopeful, to give back in a way that shows people you don't have to have winners and losers. And for the longest time, the way that city council member talked about people, that's how I felt. And when I felt like that, I lived like that. And when I lived like that, it often meant I cycled in and out of jail. And it wasn't until my last incarceration when I realized that I wasn't all those things that people said I was. I wasn't a bad person. I wasn't a dumb person. I wasn't able to change my life, that I could do things that changed my life. And it's just a sad position that we find ourselves in, where we still have that kind of rhetoric that really diminishes our ability to work together to truly have safe communities, thriving communities, and a smaller footprint on criminal justice.
One of the during the hearing today, just to back up a little bit, the bill to ban solitary confinement has a series. Basically, it puts in place a series of limitations. One of them is that you can't put someone in restrictive housing, which is the euphemism of today, which is similar, without a hearing and due process with a lawyer. And one of DOC Commissioner Louis Molina's objections was that they can't put someone, they're going to take somebody who just allegedly assaulted somebody and now won't be able to put them immediately into restrictive housing. They'll remain in general population, where in theory they would still be angry enough or whatever to start another, to attack somebody else. What do you think about that position that they shouldn't be immediately put in restrictive housing, or they should be immediately put in restrictive housing?
Let me just say this. I respect Commissioner Molina, and I am rooting for him because we're talking about real lives, right? If he's successful in doing some of the work that he laid out in his blueprint and some of the work I know him and I had talked about before I left DOC, officers will be better off, incarcerated people will be better off. So I'm really rooting for him. But I think when you talk in sound bites, you miss a big part of the overall picture. So I can tell you the rule that we had laid out at the Board of Correction and the directive, the draft directive that we had made, there is a thing called pre-detention housing, which allows that if somebody committed a grade 1 infraction, meaning that someone got hurt, that you as a department have the ability to immediately remove that person out of general population and put them into RMAS or move them out of general population. The obligation at that particular point is that you have 7 days in order to have a hearing to keep that person in that form of removed from general population. So there is a tool that allows them to immediately remove people out of general population, but at the same time have due process protections. And we should all want that, because if we start eroding due process protections, where does that leave us as a society? We're seeing it right now on a national level. It's a major, major problem. And we should all be pulling in line with, like, how do we protect due process? And due process should not get in the way of us holding people accountable.
One thing I've noticed over the past year is that the name, this is very much about terminology and names of things, restrictive housing, enhanced housing, all of these different things that they're naming seem to add up to the agency has, and I'm sure this happens in other jail agencies as well. They've come up with different names for solitary confinement that are hard to track. For example, in one jail on Rikers called NIC, there's a small unit, there's 2 small units of detainees from the jail for younger adults who have been put there in involuntary protective custody. Not totally sure what that means. But essentially what it looks like is they moved these detainees out of the jail that they were in because they were so violent, and put them in what amounts to 23-hour day lockdown in a different jail, and then called it involuntary protective custody. Just put that in context. Is that something that you've noticed? Is that something that is sort of like a backdoor way to deal with, to continue to use solitary confinement to deal with issues that the agencies that crop up in the agencies?
You know, I think Commissioner Molina really wants to find a way of keeping people safe and find alternatives. I can tell you, NIC is a horrible facility. You know, when Vinny and I were there, we said if we had our way, that wouldn't be where we would have put RMAS, right? It's just not by design a very humane facility. None of the facilities are on Rikers. That's one of the reasons why we need to close it, and we need to build the borough-based jail system, because it gives us an opportunity to reset it. In DOC, you have a lot of operational opportunities, and there are a lot of words and names that different things are called, whether it's restrictive housing, solitary confinement, second chance, true. Underneath the RMAS rule and the rule that the board put in place, all of those forms of housing would have been eliminated, and including ESH, right? And you're hearing about ESH. Apparently, the commissioner is using ESH, which is a little more structured and has a little more out of cell time than the traditional solitary confinement with the 23-hour lock-in. But none of those facilities are really designed for the kind of removal from general population and engagement in programs that we call for in RMAS, that I think Commissioner Molina would like to see. And so it's an operational decision about where you move people and where you establish that program. We could, if you looked at the RMAS model, you can take any general population housing unit if you have enough officers trained and able to, and you can implement RMAS in any general pop. There's 10 hours out of cell for level 1. There's 12 hours out of cell for level 2. There's intensive programming with individual service, behavioral service plans. There's periodic review. There's automatic progression to the next level. There's a restorative rehabilitation unit that people go to after they finish level 1, level 2, maximum of 15 days in each, a maximum of 30 between level 1 and level 2. There is a whole program set around risk management and accountability that doesn't have to be implemented in NIC. It could be implemented in any general population facility with enough officers. That is a key. That was something we had faced when we were trying to implement RMAS, having enough officers. And based on the rule, we needed about 238 officers to be able to cover the 3 tours and the multiple levels of RMAS, level 1, level 2, and RU. And each level had a small population with a higher ratio of officer, both line officer, escort officer, and captains, to be able to support the free movement and 10 hours and 12 hours out of cell and program engagement.
Did you feel a little bit of a twinge having put so much work into RMAS that it's like the landscape has shifted entirely, and you have the monitor with their own view, you have DOC with their own view, and the council bill, which offers another layer of that, and it just seems like the successive. One thing about Rikers that I've noticed, having done the book, is that there's very little continuity. You know, it seems to, depending on which way the wind is blowing, things seem to change so sharply.
Yeah, I got to tell you, what it will take is for all of the parties to at least agree on the center of where we're going. And then everybody needs to be pulling in the same direction. That is, pulling in the same direction in terms of planning and implementation. That means pulling in the same direction in terms of resources and commitment to see this through. Mayor Adams says his administration is going to be about getting stuff done. This is one of those things that we need to get done, because at the end of the day, we're talking about real people being in a system that is generating massive hurt all around. It is generating massive hurt for the over 7,000 officers who are working in DOC. It is creating hurt for the thousands of civilians who are working it, and it's creating hurt for the 5,900 people who are detained and their families. And we need to get to a place where we can get some real stuff done that provides safety, provides redemption in a way of building back, and provides the kind of supports that allow people, when they leave that system, they could be a little bit better off than when they first came in.
If I can break in for a second, we have a really good question in the bank Stanley, that I didn't want us to lose out before the time went by too fast. It's from an anonymous attendee, and he references the your trip to Norway and the Nordic approach, which is fascinating in itself. It points out, and you pointed out, that where officers are invested in the goal of supporting people inside to get a better path. And they have a 2-year academy training for COs in Norway and possibly even in other Nordic countries as well. So the questioner asked whether you'd advocate similar or more training for COs in states, even that requires, if it requires spending more money. And if you do, how do we convince the states to get on board with it, especially at a time when we have such restrained resources?
Yeah, I would absolutely support a much longer and tailored training to the population that we're currently serving. One of the challenges in New York City, as many people know, is over 50% of the people who are detained have a mental illness. Some portion of those have seriously are mentally ill. That population has changed. We don't train our officers to deal with that. We still train our officers in sort of the 19th century, 20th century corrections. It's care, custody, and control. And so what they did in Norway is they added this 2-year training that has a component that is around care, custody, and control, but it goes further out. It's about social work. It's about engagement. It's about communication. It's about crisis intervention. It's about case management. They even went as so far as, if you look at their job descriptions, you would think they're hiring social workers. Their job descriptions are described as such that they call themselves contact officers. They don't even call themselves correction officers. They call them contact officers because they are on the floor, they're having contact with people, and their job is to develop a relationship with that person, get resources to that person, and make sure that that person, when they leave, is better off. And so, yes, I would absolutely support it. The other thing is, as a nation, when people say we're strained for resources, we are a pretty well-off and wealthy nation. We have financial struggles, but this is about what do we value and where do we invest? We had no problem with investing billions of dollars to build prisons with the war on drugs and the 1994 crime bill. We had no problem with investing billions. And in fact, Eric Holder did Arnie Duncan, former Secretary of Education, did a study that looked at the investment in education and compared to the investment in prison. We invested generationally billions more than we did proportionally to education. That talks about our values. So yes, a 2-year training, it may cost, but we need to make those investments, just like we need to make investments in reentry housing because people are coming home and they have no place to live. It is what we value. If we truly value community safety, if we truly value this notion of redemption, and the crime, it might have been what you did, but it's not who you are. If we truly value that, then we need to act accordingly and make investments proportionate.
We've had correctional officers on our programs who sort of lean towards that as well. It doesn't seem like it's a tough push. So I don't understand why we're not getting anywhere with it. Have you seen any evidence that there's interest in the part of the unions or on the part of wardens or other authorities to go that far?
Well, I would.
But go ahead, Graham.
Oh no, I was just going to say, I've had retired correction officers, retired upper level people say that we're not trained. A lot of the population shouldn't even be in Rikers. They should be in better mental health facilities. Sure. And that the broken windows policing of the 90s and the 2000s was a massive mistake, which I thought was an extraordinary comment coming from a law enforcement officer.
Let me say, I have seen, as the first deputy commissioner, good people, officers who want to do good jobs, but they're not trained to manage that population. And so just imagine if every day you were charged and expected to do a job, but you were not adequately skilled and trained to do that job. How frustrating is that? how frustrating it is for people who say, I do want to be a correction officer and have a different vision about what that correction officer, like give me an opportunity to work with people to help them build a better lives. And then they get in there and they don't have the tools nor the culture that really supports that. The culture is grounded in this care, custody, and control. These are really bad people. And so we need to keep bad people in control because they're really bad people. That is just so harmful. And that's where we need to get alignment and get and to be shift. And that's why I'm so big on having this conversation about not having winners and losers. I agree with Mayor Adams that we need to have safer community. I agree we need to hold people accountable. But the how is as important as the accountability. And we can't have safe communities is if we are still removing people from the community. They are in a system that is not based on humanity and basically dehumanizes those who are detained there and those who work there. And then we release them back to their community and expect good things to happen. That doesn't make sense. And we know historically it doesn't work.
So we have another 10 minutes or so that we can go. So if anybody out there has some more questions for Stanley or Graham, please feel free. I just want to put to Stanley one of the questions we've been dealing with all day, which is that, you know, we're in a context now where any kind of reform to any part of the system is considered suspect, even though there's evidence that voters, Americans in general, would like to see changes. On the other side of it, we see rising crime, we see fears about public safety. So how do you balance trying to reform parts of the system, particularly corrections, and more specifically, solitary administrative segregation, or whatever you call it, in this atmosphere, this climate, where all of a sudden anything that looks like reform has become suspect?
I think we got to continue to speak truth. And I think I said this when I was talking to Graham, is like, oftentimes we hear the soundbite of the day, and that soundbite takes hold in our day-to-day conversations, and it takes hold in our universal psyche, our collective psyche, that everything is spiraling out of control and, you know, crime is on the rise and New York is a target. But, you know, you look at the data, it's a national thing. And then you look at New York's data, we're starting to see some improvements. But here's the other kicker. Even with all of that, you look at New York State. You look at where New York State is at. The prison population is down. It was 72,000, it's down to less than half that. The number of people on parole are down. We're closing 12 facilities, 12 prisons in New York State. And we're still seeing the numbers come down. We're seeing a slight uptick in New York City. So we know we could have safer communities. We know we could fight crime in the right way, strategically. We know that we could reduce mass incarceration to reduce the harm and the cycles of trauma that most of our communities bore, or most of the poorest communities in New York City bear. So there is a way in which we could move forward, but I think we got to keep speaking truth. We got to keep sharing the data, and we got to stop talking in sound bites. We got to have a deeper conversation.
So we have an audience of journalists from all over the country, from a lot of different platforms, a lot of different approaches. What should reporters be doing? What should they be covering to really advance this argument?
I think reporters have to cover the whole story, and as much as possible, speak to the truth of what's going on. And I think we've seen that with Graham, and Graham, I so appreciate your reporting because you're not interested in the sound bites. You're interested in the facts, the underlying facts, and the underlying options that we have as a society or as a community to begin to fight some of the systemic issues we've been dealing with around mass incarceration. So I think reporters have a particular ability to get access to data, particularly in New York, around FOIL and around some of the entities we have that hold that data. And we got to speak that truth to everybody, because we don't want another soundbite moment where we have, and there was nothing wrong with this slogan, but I'm going to use it. We have a slogan where it says, just say no to drugs. Or we have a slogan or an approach that says, we give states more money if they build more jails and they make sentences longer. We give states more money if they make sentences longer for crack cocaine as opposed to powder cocaine. Like that, those knee-jerk soundbite responses and moments have never done us any well, not well. And people impacted by it are Black and brown people, are communities with the least resources to be able to affect their own change and their own way of living. That's who's been impacted by it. And then the other portion of the population has been impacted up for the population of the population that pays for it through our tax dollars. Those dollars are not dollars that are coming from city, state, or federal coffers. Those dollars are coming from everyday communities.
It'd be nice if this was the subject of a really smart debate right now as we head towards the midterms, rather than what we're seeing now, which is a pretty simplistic, sensational-oriented debate about rising crime and the dangers of, to public safety, which really doesn't get at the point. So we'll spend the next day in our conference looking at more of the truths, as you put it, and getting, I hope, further deeper into some of the ins and outs of how things can change, how public policy might be able to change in terms of solitary and corrections policy in general. But I want to thank you, Stanley, and also Graham, for taking the time, for your patience today. This is an excellent, as it turned out, one-on-one conversation with the two of you. If anybody has more questions, I don't see any in our bank right now, but please feel free to email me the extra questions, and I will forward them to Stanley, and I'm sure he'll be happy to take a look at them and answer them back. But once again, thank you, Stanley, for joining us. Thank you, Graham, for moderating for your one-on-one, and we will call it a day this afternoon today, and we'll resume tomorrow again at 12:45 for our second day of our unfinished business solitary confinement seminar. I just want to shout out thanks to some of the people who've been working with us today. First of all, Kathy, who's our journalism coordinator, and she helped to put the fantastic program together and to get all of you together in one virtual room. I want to thank Chris Graham, who's our technical producer, should get a special clap in the hands. He's always in the back, visibly there to get over our technical issues. And certainly a special shout out of gratitude to the Langeloth Foundation for supporting, again, a really interesting project that we put on about journalism training and correctional issues in health. So thank you again, everybody. Have a great night, and we will see you tomorrow afternoon, New York time. Take care, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Take care. Bye-bye.
See you, Stanley.
Thank you, Graham.